She was a beautiful young woman, inside and out.
She was always trying to help people.
She was going places.
Until her sudden disappearance sets off red flags.
I didn't see the car.
It's 4 o'clock in the morning. She should be in bed.
Something was wrong.
Yasmin, it's Mom. Where are you?
Hey!
Had she given up everything to follow her heart?
He's the love of her life.
She wanted to be with him.
She went with him down to Mexico.
Or had she gotten in too deep to ever come back home?
He was very jealous, overall just controlling.
What did you just say to me?
I know that she believes that he is capable of hurting her.
Police located the vehicle partially burned.
My heart sank because if she wasn't in the car, where's my daughter?
There's hair. It's a body. There's hair.
April 15th, 2022. It's just before sunup in Albuquerque, New Mexico's largest city.
It's a big town with a small town feeling.
There's a lot of different cultures, a lot of ethnicities. It's a melting pot.
But the unfortunate truth about Albuquerque is that there is a lot of crime here.
At around 4 a.m., one resident, Yvonne Jaramillo, wakes up in her trailer on the city's south side.
Yvonne hears her son. He has a bad dream. She goes and checks on him.
He was crying in his sleep, so I comforted him and, made him go back to sleep.
As she's headed back to her bedroom, as any mother would, hey, why don't I check on my daughter?
I saw her door was a little open, which she never left her door open. I knocked.
Yasmin?
Then I looked in there.
But Yasmin is not in her bed.
Of course, Yvonne grows concerned.
She left everything. Her purse was there. She wouldn't go out without her purse.
Yvonne then realizes that the hook where she usually hangs the car keys, there are no keys there.
I looked out the window and I didn't see the car.
So, Yvonne makes a worried call to her daughter.
Yasmin, it's Mom. Where are you?
"20-year-old Yasmin Marquez always wanted the best for the people around her.
She was a very happy person, a hard worker, always trying to help people.
She was always supportive in the house. She was a great daughter, just such a beautiful person.
Like my son says, she was the best big sister ever.
And she was equally beautiful on the outside.
Her passion was makeup. She just loved doing makeup.
Her friends convinced her that this was her thing, and she started an Instagram page to kind of show off what she could do. At a certain point, her Instagram blew up. She got PR packages, and this became her thing.
But Yasmin was more than just a pretty face.
She was a young lady who was going places.
She was working on a career in nursing. She was going to the community college. She had a lot on her plate, and she was handling it all.
Yasmin studied hard, but also kept up her social life. And in the summer of 2021, she met a young man named Jonathan Martinez.
They did meet on social media. He had been trying for over a year to get her attention.
He was always dropping into her DMs, trying to make a love connection, but she initially wasn't interested.
Then one day, Yasmin decided, I'm gonna see what this is about. And she reached out to him.
Hey!
Hi. So what made you change your mind?
Curiosity, I guess.
Jonathan seemed like a very nice guy. He presented well.
It wasn't long before the two were an item.
She was really happy.
She truly believed that he was the one for her.
They got so serious that Jonathan gave Yasmin this promise ring.
That meant a lot for him to give her one of his rings.
This sort of really cemented their relationship, and they began talking about marriage.
But now Yasmin's mother has awakened in the middle of the night to find her daughter's bed empty and her car gone.
I got worried and I was trying to call and text her and no answer. I was like, okay, something's not right because she always picks up.
Yvonne calls everywhere, searching frantically for her daughter. She calls her friends, anyone who can put her in contact with her daughter.
Her fear mounting, she wakes up her husband, Jesus.
Wake up.
I said, Yasmin's not here, the car's not here, and that she's not picking up the phone.
That's when Yvonne and her husband decide to call police.
I'm calling because my daughter's missing. I think she's in trouble.
Initially, the parents are telling police, hey, look, this is our daughter. We know she would never just up and go away. You gotta take this seriously.
We have many children with a friend. We can't find her.
But could there be a simple explanation for her sudden disappearance?
Yasmin is an adult, and it's not even been 24 hours yet.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of reasons why people go missing, and sometimes people go missing voluntarily.
But they are like, no, this is a problem, something is wrong. And mom starts to talk.
She starts to tell the operator about Yasmin's boyfriend.
He's very dangerous. He's actually wanted for that downtown shooting.
"20-year-old Yasmin Marquez was making big plans.
She's pursuing nursing, she's doing her makeup thing, she's talking about marriage with her boyfriend.
This future was just so bright for her.
But now, after Yasmin disappeared in the middle of the night, her parents have called the police.
They're afraid she's gone to see her boyfriend, Jonathan Martinez, who they feel is dangerous.
According to family, Jonathan is wanted for a shooting.
They shot a teenager.
That got police attention.
He was alleged to have been the driver of a vehicle that was involved in a shooting.
Police are well aware of this shooting.
It left a 19-year-old teenager dead and a 16-year-old wounded.
19-year-old Trevante Robbins died at the scene.
Robbins had been in town for the 4th of July and had decided to meet up with a friend before a party.
But they never made it.
They're hanging out, and this black car just starts circling them. And all of a sudden, somebody puts a gun out and starts shooting.
Robbins was shot in the face and died instantly. And a 16-year-old companion was hit in the abdomen.
Luckily, he survives.
Homicide detectives were able to locate surveillance footage of the suspect's vehicle.
That led detectives to a man named Jonathan Martinez.
He was identified as being the driver.
Then text messages and social media chatter led them to another man involved in the shooting.
That man was Assad Moody.
He was believed to be the shooter.
The facts of the crime are tragic.
Apparently, they were looking for a young man who had beaten up Moody.
They go out to get revenge.
Ultimately, it was a case of mistaken identity.
Moody had fired on a group of complete strangers.
And the aftermath was just as baffling.
Assad Moody took responsibility for his actions. He turned himself in, later pled guilty, but not Jonathan.
At the time that the warrant for his indictment was issued, he had apparently fled and was suspected to be in Mexico.
The guy was living in Juarez.
According to Yasmin's parents, he hadn't gone alone.
She actually was with him in Juarez, and she came back last week.
She was in Albuquerque for approximately 1 week before she went missing.
Based on the information from Yasmin's parents, the dispatcher escalates the call.
They decided it was an endangered missing girl.
We will go ahead and have a deputy come make contact with you.
Him being on the run and him having an active warrant for his arrest was a big concern.
When detectives arrive at their home, Yvonne says she had no idea that Jonathan was a wanted man when her daughter left.
She explained that Yasmin only found out about this shooting right before they went to Mexico.
He told her that he had a warrant, but that he wanted to give it some time because he was going to come back and clear it up because he was not involved.
Of course, he denies it all to her, and she follows them there because he's the love of her life, and they plan to get married.
She says that she loved him and that she wanted to be with him.
She says that she had only learned of the arrest warrant after the fact.
A family member sent over a video from the news saying that he had to appear in court. And I'm like, why? Is he hiding something?
Yvonne explains that she Googled Jonathan's name. That is how she found out about this arrest warrant.
Yasmin's mother just knew she was in danger over in Mexico, and she wanted her home.
I kept telling her, you need to come back.
Yasmin said no, she needed to be by his side. She didn't believe the allegations against him.
I even tried sending a family member over to get her, but she would not. Just didn't want out. So, the relationship.
But Yvonne tells detectives that recently, something changed.
I got a call from my daughter a few days later saying that she wanted to come back home.
She said she didn't feel safe there.
I told her, well, you don't even have to ask. Come back home as soon as possible. And she said, okay.
Yvonne sent Yasmin money for a bus ticket, and just like that, she was back home.
But now, Yasmin has disappeared.
Yvonne is worried that she has run off to be with Jonathan again. Detectives ask Yvonne, do you think Yasmin went back to Mexico? And she explains no.
Because before detectives arrived, she'd spoken to Yasmin's best friend.
This friend told Yvonne that Yasmin said Jonathan was now back in town.
Supposedly, he was coming back to turn himself in.
The mother of missing 20-year-old Yasmin Marquez has just told detectives that she thinks her daughter might have left to meet up with her fugitive boyfriend, Jonathan Martinez.
Allegedly, he'd been hiding out in Mexico because of his involvement in a drive-by shooting that left one teenager dead and another injured.
But if Yasmin is with Jonathan, it appears she went willingly.
Police, of course, want to know, Yvonne, did you hear anything that morning?
Yvonne explains that she didn't hear any type of altercation in the middle of the night. There was no signs of struggle in her room. Everything is in place, no disturbance.
So everyone concludes that Yasmin left on her own volition. No one forced her out of that house.
One thing is certain, though. If Jonathan had told Yasmin that he was going to turn himself in, he hasn't done it yet.
There's no records of him contacting police, the DA's office, the sheriff's office, the fugitive squad, the marshal's office.
Detectives wonder if maybe Yasmin had a change of heart.
Maybe Yasmin decided that I want to be with Jonathan. He came back to get her, and they left for Mexico, and that's where they are.
As detectives are finishing up with Yasmin's parents, her best friend, Ketsia Loya, arrives at the house.
I'm really worried about
Her friend expressed immediate concern to law enforcement.
We used to talk often until she started dating him. She got really distant.
Jonathan was very controlling, didn't allow her to put makeup on. He was very jealous.
When she was on the phone, she would have to have it on speaker so he could hear every word of every conversation.
According to Ketsia, Yasmin was essentially held in Juarez against her will.
He was locking her up in the house, and that's the reason why she couldn't text me, because she didn't have Wi-Fi. She went to the bathroom, he would go after her. She wouldn't do anything alone.
He spent every moment of his life watching over her.
There were verbal threats, emotional threats, perhaps even physical threats.
She was notices beating on me.
Ketsia alleges the violence escalated to the point Yasmin had to draw the line.
The reason she ultimately made that decision to come back to the United States was that Jonathan Martinez had pointed a gun at her head.
That's when Yasmin knew she had to get out of there.
She didn't feel safe with him anymore.
Exactly how Yasmin escaped is unclear, but it happened in a hurry.
She realized that she would be in danger if she continued to stay there.
And now it appears that Jonathan has followed Yasmin back to Albuquerque.
Ketsia explains that Yasmin had texted her to tell her Jonathan was back in town.
Supposedly, his friend had driven him back to New Mexico.
The evidence certainly seems to indicate that he came back from Mexico to confront her.
Yasmin was afraid that Jonathan would beat her for leaving him.
I know that she believes that he's capable of hurting her.
Despite that, her friend fears Yasmin met with him anyway.
She is worried that Yasmin may have suffered more than a beating.
That's because around 1:30 a.m., Yasmin sent her a chilling text message.
It said, "I'm gonna get killed, bro." And it was followed by a skull emoji.
Ketsia Loya, best friend of Yasmin Marquez, has just shown detectives an ominous text message that the missing woman sent her shortly before she disappeared.
She says that I'm gonna get killed.
This certainly suggests that Yasmin could be in danger.
After talking to Yasmin's parents and best friend, detectives head back to the station.
Once the sheriff's department knew of her association with Jonathan Martinez, there were efforts made right away to get her entered into NCIC nationwide as a missing and endangered person.
We were able to push out a bolo, be on the lookout for her vehicle.
There were immediate emergency search warrants that were served to get her phone records, in an attempt to identify who she was communicating with and also geolocations.
Then, detectives attempt to contact Jonathan and the friend that allegedly brought him back from Mexico.
They went to each of their last known addresses, but they never located the two.
But it's the bolo on Yasmin's vehicle that gives detectives their first indication of what's happened to her.
We were contacted by the Corrales Police Department, which is to the north of Albuquerque.
The vehicle was parked on the back country road, all dirt. There's very few houses in that area.
They located the vehicle partially burned.
Detectives have the car towed to conduct their search.
Apparently, someone set the car on fire, but they closed the doors and the windows, and the flames sputtered out,
which left a substantial amount of evidence behind.
First of all, they found a canister of lighter fluid.
That's possibly used as an accelerant to start the vehicle on fire.
They found a phone case that had Yasmin's driver's license and also her social security card, but there was no phone.
They also find burnt clothing. Some of the clothing appears to have blood on it.
Other things were a Sprite bottle and some rings that were believed to belong to Jonathan Martinez.
Have a seat.
After the search of Yasmin's car, detectives circle back to her best friend, Ketsia.
She had access to Yasmin's Snapchat account, and she pulled up some pictures of the ring that Yasmin wore and showed them, saying, look, she's wearing it right here.
That's the ring that Jonathan gave her?
Yeah.
Yasmin was still wearing this ring when she came back from Mexico.
I had asked her like why she hadn't taken it off, and she said that it's just gonna take time because she was still hurting from everything. I was like, well, just take off the ring, like it's not worth it. You're just gonna like keep thinking about it.
I couldn't imagine what she felt like to watch somebody who you love be abused. All she could do was try to be there and protect her and be her advocate.
Jonathan is a strong suspect, but he's not the only man detectives have questions about.
When I started to dive into the phone records of Yasmin, we look at some of the last people that she spoke to that day. And one of them was another kid named Brian. That was one of the last ones. And then it was Jonathan.
You know Brian?
Brian Ramirez? Yeah. She was like really good friends with him.
What do you mean good friends?
Ketsia tells detectives that Yasmin had recently reconnected with Brian.
He had asked her out to eat, I believe, like a couple days after she was here.
Was it possible this guy wanted more from Yasmin than she could give and got jealous?
Detectives follow up on the lead and invite Yasmin's other romantic interest in for an interview.
He predominantly spoke Spanish.
He confirms that he has known Yasmin since high school, but he lost touch with her after graduation. He explains that in early April, they connected again and they had hung out a few times.
After Yasmin got back from Mexico, they started hooking up.
He also explains that they hooked up the night that Yasmin disappeared.
He claims that Yasmin had picked him up at his house around 11:30 that Thursday night.
They went to the hotel parking lot, hung out in the car as friends with benefits. After that, they hung out enjoying one another's company.
He tells police that as they sat in the car, Yasmin had told him she was afraid of Jonathan.
He says that Yasmin told him that Jonathan was dangerous, that he was abusive.
She said she'd only escaped him in Juarez because she had managed to lock Jonathan in a room.
She was scared. She thought she was going to get hurt.
Brian Ramirez, the new man in Yasmin Marquez's life, has just told police that on the night she disappeared, she told him she feared her boyfriend Jonathan was going to kill her.
He tells police that while he and Yasmin were hanging out, her phone was blowing up, and it was Jonathan.
Like this.
Why won't you answer?
I love him, but I'm scared of him.
He told police that Yasmin eventually picked up the phone.
He could hear something to the effect that I'm coming, you better not be with anybody else.
He says shortly after they hung up, Yasmin took him home.
He asked her point blank, "Are you going to see Jonathan tonight?" Yasmin said no way, but he didn't think she was being honest about that.
And he hasn't heard from her since.
He said that he texted Yasmin the next morning. The messages was read, but there was no reply.
But is he telling the truth?
At this point, detectives confiscate his phone and they take swabs for DNA.
But while detectives are still wondering if they have a new suspect, they learn that police have just picked up Jonathan on his prior arrest warrant for the drive-by shooting.
Law enforcement knew he was back in the area. They were able to locate him. He was in a vehicle with a prior girlfriend of his at the time. Officers and deputies move in and make their arrest.
Arresting officers find him in possession of 2 phones.
One of those phones belongs to Yasmin.
When the detective sits down with Jonathan, he does his best to get some answers.
We had him transported to be interviewed, and I interviewed him.
Maybe there's a reason why something happened. I could tell everybody, not everything's black and white.
He tried to provide this narrative, anything could have happened, but Jonathan wasn't biting at all.
I'm not gonna answer no questions. There's, you know what I'm saying, I don't have a lawyer here.
Basically, he just lawyers up. But the lead detective pushes a little more.
So I think somebody that would have loved her would help us out, try to figure out where she's at.
Yeah, your guess is just as good as mine, you know what I'm saying? Like, I've just been trying to lay low because I have a warrant.
Jonathan denies meeting up with Yasmin. He says, I don't know where she is.
I'm telling you right now, we didn't go nowhere.
I tried different angles, but he wouldn't budge. He didn't really have anything to say to us.
So I don't know where she's at. That's what I'm telling you.
So the detective concludes the interview.
As they prepare to wrap up this so-called interview, they have a parting shot for Jonathan.
Wherever she's at, I mean, hopefully we find her good and healthy. Because it seems like the people that she loved don't really care about her.
This triggers Jonathan.
And when he's left alone in the room, he makes a telling statement.
If she is still alive, shouldn't it be I love her, not I loved her?
With Jonathan stonewalling them, detectives go another route for information.
I obtained a search warrant for his phone, and we did what's called a phone extraction, and then we can see everything.
The data they recover tells them everything they need to know.
Their cell phone records showed us a path of travel when she went missing.
He was with Yasmin in this area, and we see their cell phones heading out to the Pajarito Mesa. And then Yasmin's phone went off.
After that, Jonathan's phone heads back to Albuquerque, stopping at a gas station along the way.
He then continued to travel for upwards of 25 to 30 miles north to a nearby town called Bernalillo.
But that isn't the end of his journey.
He stops north in the Jemez Mountains and stays there for a while, then heads back south to Albuquerque.
Detectives suspect that a search of the area could lead them to Yasmin.
Initially, all the data that we had from the phones were putting them out on the Pajarito Mesa. So we exhausted canines, helicopters, and we took 50 deputies and detectives, and we just walked in a straight line around the points looking for anything we could find. But we found nothing.
Detectives grow increasingly frustrated.
We just couldn't stop until we could find her. So we work with the Albuquerque Police Department's digital forensic team. They do incredible work for us.
Detective Carol and Detective Marina Lorena reached out and asked for help, and so I started helping.
And soon, they make a breakthrough.
Most of the people we encounter haven't really pre-planned a lot of things. So they're not pre-planning, I need to turn off my phone. So there's just always little breadcrumbs that we're hoping to find and kind of piece together.
She's like, I think I know where she's at. And I said, oh my gosh, are you serious? And she's like, yeah. She says they were using a tower in Jemez. And she did some math and was like, I think it's probably around mile marker 9 on 550.
Detectives get just past a turnout at mile marker number 9 and come to a stop.
As soon as I exited my vehicle, I could smell rotting flesh.
It smells like something's dead. Can you smell that? Yeah.
And behind a bush not far off that road, they find a pile of roofing shingles.
I lifted up some of the shingles.
There's hair. It's a body. There's hair.
Following data from Jonathan Martinez's cell phone, detectives have found human remains in a remote desert location outside Albuquerque.
I was in my office. I will probably never forget this moment. Detective Carroll called me and he said, hey, we found her. I can't even describe the feeling of like how good that felt, because I don't know if you ever really get a sense of justice, right? Because you never get your person back. But at least you know where she is now. It's just being able to give that closure.
It was very bittersweet. We were glad that our efforts had finally found her, but obviously not in the way that the family would like to, right?
It leads to a conversation that no detective ever wants to have.
They just let us know that they had found remains of a young woman. They believed it was Yasmin, but they were not sure yet until they did DNA and all that.
Mom gave me some information about her dental visits, and I supplied that to the Office of the Medical Investigator.
They were able to use dental records to then positively identify the remains.
It was just a big shock because I feel like as a mother, you always know if something's wrong. And I always knew that something was not right, but I guess I didn't want to lose hope.
While it was clear the remains belonged to Yasmin, her cause of death was less certain.
There were no obvious injuries to the body that remained. It appeared most likely that some kind of suffocation or asphyxiation would account for the lack of other injuries that were observed.
We're finally then felt, okay, now we can hold him accountable for the things that he did.
With Jonathan already in custody, prosecutors charge him with murder, while detectives compile their evidence against him.
They tracked down any surveillance footage they could find along that fateful route revealed through the phone data.
Surveillance video was crucial in this case. There was video of someone who fit his description going to a gas station, coming out with one bottle of Sprite.
We were able to see Jonathan in her car. Now, in that car, we don't see Yasmin up front. We don't see her in the back seat.
The detectives were also able to then go to the Walmart up in Bernalillo, where the phones had suggested that Jonathan Martinez was, and then is seen on video purchasing a single item, being a bottle of lighter fluid.
It's very clear that Jonathan was our guy.
In August of 2024, Jonathan first stands trial for the 2021 murder of Trevante Robbins in the drive-by shooting.
Assad Moody, the shooter in the drive-by, pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison, but he did not testify against Jonathan.
And without Assad's testimony, the prosecutors are unable to secure a conviction.
It was a hung jury. They were unable to return a unanimous verdict.
A lot is riding on the outcome when Jonathan stands trial for Yasmin's murder in October 2024.
Our strategy was to present as much of that digital evidence to really narrow down on that there was nobody else that could have been responsible for this homicide other than Jonathan Martinez.
Prosecutors used the evidence to lay out their theory of what happened that night.
There are communications that says, do I need to be worried that you're going to beat me up? So there was obviously concerns and kind of implied threats from him. And when they met in the park and then drove off, probably there was an argument that started.
Why did you leave me like that?
Because I've got better things to do than hide out in Mexico.
You locked me up.
She had been sexually involved earlier in the day. It may have been something like that that then finally triggered what happened.
How many times do I have to tell you I'll kill you? Wait, before you get it through your head.
You're hurting me, Jonathan.
He killed her and then dumped her body out into the desert.
He then took her car, drove it out to Corrales, and lit it partially on fire. I think he thought that the car would explode and get rid of the evidence, but it didn't.
It was circumstantial, but with the digital evidence, as well as a Sprite bottle that was recovered, and DNA testing did identify Jonathan Martinez's DNA on that Sprite bottle. It seemed to be a pretty strong connection.
Taking the stand in his defense, Jonathan does admit to meeting Yasmin that night.
He admitted that he had met up with her at the park and that they had left the park together in her car. He stated that she dropped him off at a friend's house and that was the last he saw of her.
Which might have been enough, if not for the mountain of evidence prosecutors had.
He couldn't explain him driving Yasmin's car. He couldn't explain him buying the lighter fluid. He couldn't explain a lot.
It was very obvious he was lying.
They find him guilty of first-degree murder.
The judge sentenced Jonathan to life in prison, and that means he has to serve 30 years before he is eligible for parole.
It's a relief that Jonathan will finally be held accountable for his actions.
I was in shock. I was feeling so many emotions. I just dropped to the ground, and I thanked God.
But I think there's never really justice because Yasmin's family is always going to have one less person at the table.
It's been very hard for our family. Everybody is really affected by it. It's not the same without her.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available. Call the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE.
No one who stood in that frozen patch of woodland on a cold February morning in 1957 could have imagined they were looking at one of the most haunting crime scenes in American history. There were no shattered windows, no signs of struggle stretching across a suburban street, no frantic emergency calls from terrified neighbors, only an old cardboard bassinet box lying in the weeds, partially hidden beneath tangled brush, as though someone had hoped the wilderness itself would erase the truth. Inside that box rested the body of a little boy. He appeared no older than 4. No one knew his name. For decades, America would know him only by a title that sounded less like a child and more like a ghost. The Boy in the Box. The discovery happened on February 25, 1957, in the Fox Chase section of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The location was quiet, almost forgotten. A small wooded lot beside Susquehanna Road, where illegal dumping was common and few people paid attention to abandoned trash. The winter air was sharp. Bare tree branches rattled in the wind. Nothing about the landscape suggested that history was about to stop there forever. The man who first noticed the box did not immediately report it. He had entered the area searching for muskrats, hoping to find animals trapped along the creek. When he realized what he had seen, fear overtook reason. Hunting in that location was illegal, and he worried that contacting police would bring unwanted questions. He left without saying a word. Days passed. The cardboard box remained exactly where it had been abandoned. Cars rolled past on nearby roads. Families carried on with ordinary life. Children laughed in neighborhoods only minutes away. Meanwhile, an unidentified child lay alone beneath the winter sky. Eventually, another passerby noticed the box and contacted authorities. Police officers arrived expecting another case of illegal dumping. Instead, detectives stepped into a mystery that would consume generations. The victim was a young Caucasian boy, estimated to be between 4 and 6 years old. He measured approximately 3 feet 6 inches tall and weighed around 30 pounds. His light blonde hair had recently been cut unevenly, as though someone had trimmed it in haste shortly before his death. His blue eyes were closed forever. He was completely naked. A cheap plaid blanket had been wrapped loosely around his body before being placed inside the bassinet carton. There were bruises scattered across his face and body. Old scars suggested he had suffered injuries long before the final assault that ended his life. His fingernails had been carefully trimmed. His body had been washed. Someone had taken time to remove traces that might reveal his identity. It was a disturbing contradiction. Whoever abandoned the child had displayed extraordinary cruelty. Yet afterward, they seemed strangely concerned with presentation. The boy's stomach was empty. Medical examiners concluded he had eaten very little before his death. The official autopsy determined that he had died from blunt force trauma. Exactly where he had been killed remained unknown. Exactly who had carried him into the woods remained unknown. Most shocking of all, no one came looking for him. Within hours of the discovery, Philadelphia police launched one of the largest identification efforts the city had ever seen. Officers believed recognition would happen quickly. Surely someone, a parent, teacher, neighbor, doctor, or shopkeeper, would recognize the child once his photograph appeared in newspapers. They underestimated the silence. Fingerprint experts carefully recorded the boy's prints despite his young age. Thousands of missing child reports from across the United States were reviewed. Hospitals were contacted. Schools examined attendance records. Churches checked baptism files. Children's homes provided rosters. Adoption agencies searched their paperwork. Nothing matched. The child seemed to exist outside every official record. As investigators widened the search, they focused on the cardboard box itself. It had originally contained a white bassinet manufactured for infants. Tracing the shipment, detectives learned it had been sold through a department store in the Philadelphia area. From there, investigators followed invoices, warehouse records, and delivery receipts, hoping to identify the customer who purchased it. The trail ended in frustration. Too many customers. Too little documentation. No single buyer could be isolated. The blanket became another critical clue. It was mass-produced. Common. Available through numerous retailers. Again, nothing. Detectives examined every inch of the boy's body. His hair had been freshly cut, with loose strands still clinging to his skin. Technicians carefully collected them, believing they might contain evidence from the killer or the location where the haircut occurred. The ears drew attention. One ear appeared slightly unusual in shape. Dental records were created. Facial features were documented. Everything that might someday identify him was preserved. Still, there was no name. The Philadelphia Police Department understood that publicity would be essential. Photographs of the child appeared across newspapers nationwide. Radio stations interrupted programming. Television broadcasts appealed directly to viewers. Authorities pleaded with the public. Who knows this little boy? Who has not seen a child recently? Who recognizes his face? The response was overwhelming. Thousands of tips flooded into police headquarters. Every telephone rang. Every detective chased another possibility. Some callers insisted the boy belonged to neighbors who had suddenly moved away. Others believed he had been kidnapped from another state. Several people thought they recognized him from orphanages or playgrounds. Every lead demanded investigation. Nearly all collapsed within hours. The case expanded into a labyrinth of false hope. Meanwhile, forensic specialists noticed another troubling detail. The boy's hair appeared to have been cut after death, or very shortly before it. Why? Was someone trying to disguise his appearance? Remove evidence? Prevent recognition? No answer emerged. His body also showed signs of prolonged neglect. Medical experts observed that he appeared underweight. Some scars had already healed. Others were more recent. There were indications of repeated physical abuse. Investigators increasingly believed this child had endured suffering long before his final hours. That realization transformed the case. The question was no longer only who killed him. It became, who allowed him to disappear completely? Philadelphia in 1957 was a city of tightly connected neighborhoods. People knew one another. Children played on sidewalks under watchful eyes. Teachers recognized every student. Clergy visited families. Milk deliveries arrived every morning. In such communities, a missing child should have been impossible to overlook. Yet nobody reported him. Detectives struggled to understand how a young boy could vanish without leaving even the faintest administrative footprint. Had he never attended school? Had he lived isolated inside a house? Was he born under another identity? Or had fear silenced everyone who knew him? As weeks became months, investigators broadened the search far beyond Pennsylvania. State police agencies exchanged files. Federal authorities assisted with comparisons. Military families were considered. Traveling carnival workers. Seasonal laborers. Recent immigrants. Every possibility remained open. One clue briefly raised optimism. The cardboard box contained tiny traces of industrial residue that suggested storage inside a warehouse before being discarded. Could workers remember who had taken it? Police interviewed employees. Nothing. The investigation became increasingly dependent upon painstaking detective work. Every barber shop within driving distance received visits. Could anyone remember cutting the blonde hair of a frightened little boy shortly before February 1957? No one could. Laundry services were questioned about the blanket. Doctors were asked whether they had treated a child bearing similar scars. Again, silence. The crime scene itself revealed little. Tire tracks had long since been disturbed. Rain and winter weather erased footprints. Animals had already begun affecting evidence. The delay between the body's abandonment and official discovery cost investigators precious forensic opportunities that modern science might have preserved. In today's world, surveillance cameras would track vehicles. Cell phone records would establish movements. DNA databases could identify relatives within days. None of those tools existed. Investigators relied instead upon notebooks, interviews, instinct, and patience. Each unanswered question deepened public fascination. Parents looked at their own children differently. Schools discussed stranger danger long before the phrase became common. Newspapers printed emotional editorials asking how any society could allow a child to die anonymously. Artists even created facial reconstructions intended to show how the boy might have appeared while alive. Copies hung inside post offices, police stations, government buildings. Thousands saw his face. No one recognized him. One detective later admitted the emotional burden became almost unbearable. Murder investigations often ended with arrests. Even when victims initially lacked identification, names usually emerged through persistence. This case refused every conventional expectation. It was as though the child had appeared from nowhere solely to disappear forever. The investigators refused to surrender. They revisited witnesses repeatedly, returned to the wooded lot countless times, measured distances, reconstructed vehicle approaches, examined weather reports, calculated decomposition timelines, reviewed every missing child bulletin ever filed within practical range. Each effort ended exactly where it had begun, at a cardboard box, at a nameless child, at a silence that seemed almost impossible. Then another unsettling detail entered the investigation. The location where the body had been found was visible from the road only under certain conditions. Whoever abandoned the child appeared familiar enough with the area to know that the box would remain concealed unless someone wandered unusually deep into the brush. It suggested planning rather than panic. Someone had chosen that place deliberately. Someone believed it would hide the truth. Yet for all the apparent planning, one contradiction continued to trouble detectives. The bassinet box itself was ordinary, bulky, and awkward to carry. It was hardly the ideal container for secretly transporting a body. Why use something so conspicuous? Was it simply the nearest available object inside a home? Or had it once belonged to the child himself, a final connection to a life investigators still could not see? The question lingered unanswered as winter slowly gave way to spring. Flowers bloomed across Philadelphia. Families gathered in parks. New headlines replaced old ones. But inside police headquarters, one photograph never left the detectives' desks. The image showed a small blonde boy whose identity remained beyond reach, his face forever suspended between innocence and violence, between memory and oblivion. Every morning investigators looked at that photograph, believing the next telephone call might finally reveal his name. Instead, each day ended exactly as the last. No family arrived. No parent stepped forward. No birth certificate surfaced. No school remembered him. No neighborhood claimed him. The investigation had only just begun, yet already it was becoming something far larger than a single homicide. It was evolving into a question that would haunt detectives, journalists, and ordinary Americans alike for generations. How could a little boy live, suffer, die, and be abandoned, without anyone in the world admitting they knew who he was? Every unanswered homicide carries its own weight. A missing weapon, a vanished suspect, a witness who never speaks. But this investigation was different. Detectives were not chasing a killer whose identity had slipped away. They were searching for a child who seemed never to have existed. Before they could solve a murder, they had to answer a question so basic that it should have taken hours, not decades. Who was the little boy lying inside the cardboard box? The search expanded with relentless determination. Philadelphia police worked alongside neighboring jurisdictions, exchanging photographs, fingerprints, and descriptions. Missing person reports from across the United States were requested by mail. Clerks opened filing cabinets, stuffed with paper records. Detectives spread photographs across conference tables, comparing faces one by one. Every blonde-haired child reported missing within a reasonable age range became a possibility. Every possibility demanded time. Every comparison ended the same way. It wasn't him. The victim's fingerprints were distributed nationwide. Investigators hoped that perhaps the child had been fingerprinted through an adoption agency, a hospital, or another official institution. It was an optimistic theory, but childhood fingerprint records were uncommon in the 1950s. Days turned into weeks with no match. The autopsy remained the investigation's silent anchor. Every physical characteristic was documented in extraordinary detail, preserving evidence that investigators believed would eventually identify the child. He had blue eyes, fair skin, blonde hair. His teeth were healthy enough to suggest he had received at least some care during his short life. Yet there were also unmistakable signs that told a darker story. His body showed evidence of previous injuries that had healed before his death. Bruises of varying ages suggested repeated trauma rather than a single violent event. Medical examiners could not determine exactly how long the abuse had continued, only that it almost certainly predated the fatal assault. That conclusion shifted the focus of the investigation. If the child had suffered abuse over time, someone had seen him. Someone had fed him. Someone had clothed him. Someone had watched those injuries appear. Someone knew his name. Police began interviewing physicians throughout the Philadelphia region. Pediatricians reviewed patient files. Emergency rooms searched their admission logs. Had any young boy with repeated injuries been examined? Had any child suddenly stopped appearing for appointments? Had any family abruptly disappeared after seeking treatment? No one remembered a patient who matched. Schools became another critical avenue. Although the victim's exact age remained uncertain, investigators believed he was old enough that someone, perhaps a teacher, perhaps a principal, might recognize him. Attendance records were checked, enrollment lists examined, class photographs reviewed. Teachers stared at newspaper images, hoping memory would bridge the gap between a grainy photograph and a familiar face. Nothing. Churches opened baptism records. Children's charities searched intake files. Foster agencies reviewed placements. Orphanages compared photographs against every child who had ever entered their care. Each search generated fresh hope. Each ended in disappointment. As the months passed, another unsettling realization emerged. The absence of records was becoming evidence in itself. Perhaps this little boy had never attended school. Perhaps he had never visited a doctor. Perhaps he had lived almost entirely hidden from public view. If that was true, investigators faced an even more disturbing possibility. The child might have spent nearly his entire life isolated behind the walls of a single house, invisible to everyone except the people responsible for him. Philadelphia newspapers refused to let the story fade. Headlines reminded readers that the child remained unidentified. Editors published updated photographs and artist renderings. Civic organizations joined the campaign. Flyers appeared in storefront windows. Churches mentioned the case during services. Community groups organized discussions, urging anyone with even the smallest piece of information to come forward. The response remained enormous. So did the frustration. Some callers insisted they had seen the boy walking with an older woman. Others believed he belonged to migrant laborers who had quietly left the state. One anonymous letter claimed the child had been raised by relatives who feared legal consequences if they admitted his existence. Every claim was investigated. None could be substantiated. Meanwhile, detectives revisited the wooded lot where the body had been found. The terrain was carefully mapped. Distances to nearby roads were measured again. Investigators walked possible routes an offender might have taken while carrying the box. They studied tire access points, drainage patterns, and sight lines from passing vehicles. The location suggested familiarity. It did not appear random. Someone choosing that spot likely knew the area well enough to believe the body would remain undiscovered. That assumption opened a new strategy. Police began examining residents, workers, and frequent visitors who lived or traveled near the scene. Utility employees, delivery drivers, groundskeepers, hunters, construction workers. Anyone who regularly passed through the Fox Chase area became a potential witness. The interviews produced fragments, but no breakthrough. One resident recalled seeing an unfamiliar automobile several nights before the discovery, but could not describe it with certainty. Another believed they had noticed tire marks leading toward the woods, though weather had already erased whatever evidence once existed. Investigators documented every observation. None could be independently confirmed. The cardboard bassinet box continued attracting attention. Detectives traced its manufacturing and retail distribution as thoroughly as records allowed. They identified the department store chain through which similar bassinets had been sold and attempted to narrow customer lists. But mass retailing in the 1950s generated little of the detailed purchasing information investigators would expect today. Cash transactions left virtually no trail. The box became another dead end. The blanket proved equally elusive. Though distinctive enough to be remembered by someone familiar with it, it had been manufactured in large quantities. Thousands of identical blankets had been sold across multiple states. Ownership could not be established. One of the more puzzling details remained the child's haircut. Forensic examination suggested the hair had been cut recently. Loose clippings remained attached to parts of the body. Detectives theorized that whoever cut the hair may have done so shortly before or shortly after death. They questioned barbers throughout Philadelphia and neighboring communities, carrying photographs into shop after shop. Most barbers looked carefully. Many expressed sympathy. None recognized the boy. Police artists produced increasingly refined facial depictions, attempting to show the child as he might have appeared alive rather than after death. The images softened injuries, restored natural expression, and emphasized youthful features. Detectives hoped a living face would trigger memories that morgue photographs could not. The campaign spread beyond Pennsylvania. Law enforcement agencies in neighboring states received updated materials. National publications carried articles describing the unidentified victim. Letters arrived from across America. Some offered prayers. Others offered speculation. Few offered evidence. Behind closed doors, detectives debated competing theories. Had the child been kidnapped? If so, where was the ransom demand? Where were the frantic parents? Had he been born outside conventional systems and never officially documented? Could a legal adoption or custody arrangements explain the absence of records? Or had the killer deliberately constructed an entirely false identity around the child, ensuring that no official institution ever knew he existed? Every theory explained part of the mystery. None explained all of it. The investigation also considered whether the child may have belonged to a traveling family that moved frequently enough to avoid notice. Seasonal agricultural workers crossed state lines each year. Carnival employees traveled constantly. Military families relocated between assignments. Detectives contacted organizations connected to these communities, searching for reports of a missing child who resembled the victim. Again, there was no match. As months became years, investigators developed an unusual relationship with the case. New detectives inherited boxes of reports from retiring colleagues. Fresh eyes reviewed old interviews. Marginal notes written years earlier became starting points for new inquiries. Every generation of investigators believed they might notice what predecessors had overlooked. Sometimes they found small inconsistencies. Never the answer. The little boy remained known only by his heartbreaking nickname. His actual birthday was unknown. His parents remained unknown. Even his final hours could only be reconstructed through physical evidence. The absence of certainty allowed rumors to flourish. Some claimed organized crime had disposed of the child. Others believed the case involved an underground adoption network. Still others insisted wealthy families had used influence to suppress the truth. Investigators found no verified evidence supporting these claims, but the rumors reflected a deeper reality. The public struggled to accept that an ordinary homicide investigation could fail so completely. The emotional impact extended beyond law enforcement. Medical examiners remembered the child long after other cases had faded from memory. Reporters who covered the story continued asking questions years later. Citizens who had followed the headlines preserved newspaper clippings in family scrapbooks. Parents looked at photographs of the unidentified victim and imagined their own children. The mystery refused to disappear. At police headquarters, evidence was preserved with unusual care. Clothing was absent, but every physical clue recovered from the scene was catalogued. Hair samples, fingernail scrapings, photographs, dental charts, measurements. Investigators understood that science evolves. Even if contemporary techniques failed, future generations might possess tools unavailable in 1957. It was a remarkably forward-looking decision. At the time, few could have imagined DNA profiling, computerized databases, or forensic genealogy. Yet by preserving the evidence, detectives unknowingly protected the possibility that one day technology might answer questions that human investigation could not. Still, that future remained decades away. For now, detectives relied on interviews, persistence, and instinct. One interview led to another. One rumor generated another search. Another search produced another disappointment. The investigation settled into a painful rhythm that repeated year after year. Hope rose with every promising lead, only to collapse beneath the weight of missing proof. Yet even amid failure, one fact remained impossible to ignore. Somewhere, someone had carried a frightened little boy through the final days of his life. Someone had wrapped him in a blanket. Someone had placed him inside a cardboard bassinet box. Someone had driven to a quiet roadside in Philadelphia under the cover of darkness. Someone had walked into the winter woods, set the box beneath tangled brush, and left without looking back. Whether that person acted alone or with help remained unknown. Whether they believed the child would never be found remained unknown. But investigators became convinced of one thing. This was not a spontaneous act. Too many deliberate choices had been made. Too many traces had been erased. The victim's body had been washed. His hair had been cut. No clothing remained. No identifying belongings were left behind. Every action pointed toward concealment. Every concealment suggested that the killer understood exactly what investigators would need to identify the child, and had tried to deny them each piece in advance. The murder itself was horrifying. The effort to erase the victim's identity was even more chilling. Because a killer can hide a body. A killer can destroy evidence. A killer can disappear into the night. But to erase an entire child's existence required something far more disturbing. It required the confidence that no one, anywhere, would come searching. Years passed, but the file never gathered dust. It remained one of those rare investigations that refused to become ordinary. New murders arrived. New victims demanded justice. Detectives retired. Promotions came and went. Entire investigative units changed. Yet somewhere inside police headquarters, the photograph of the unidentified boy continued staring back from the case file. Every officer who inherited the investigation understood they were not simply pursuing a killer. They were carrying the responsibility of giving a forgotten child back his identity. The passage of time changed the city. Philadelphia grew. Neighborhoods expanded. Roads were widened. Businesses opened where empty lots had once stood. Children who had been in elementary school when the body was discovered became adults with families of their own. Still, no one stepped forward to say, "I knew him." That silence became almost as unsettling as the murder itself. Investigators returned repeatedly to the autopsy findings, believing the victim's body still held unanswered questions. Medical experts re-examined photographs, measurements, and preserved evidence using improved forensic methods that had not existed in the late 1950s. While science advanced, the conclusions remained largely consistent. The child had suffered chronic neglect. He had endured repeated physical injuries before his death. His fatal injuries resulted from blunt force trauma. Beyond those facts, certainty dissolved into probability. The scars on his body continued to attract attention. Some appeared accidental, the kind active children might receive while playing. Others were harder to explain. Their varying stages of healing suggested they had occurred over time rather than during a single violent episode. Investigators believed the pattern was consistent with repeated abuse, though they could not determine exactly who inflicted those injuries or under what circumstances. Another detail continued to trouble forensic specialists. Despite signs of mistreatment, the child's fingernails had been neatly trimmed. His hair had been recently cut. His body had been cleaned before being abandoned. Those actions did not erase evidence completely, but they indicated deliberate handling after death or shortly beforehand. Why would someone capable of killing a child spend additional time washing the body? The question divided investigators. One theory suggested practical motives. Washing the body could remove blood, fibers, fingerprints, or other forensic evidence. Cutting the hair might further complicate identification. Another possibility was psychological. Some offenders attempt to restore dignity to victims after committing acts of violence, not from compassion, but from guilt, denial, or emotional conflict. Investigators could not determine whether that behavior applied here. There was simply too little evidence to support any single explanation. The uncertainty became a defining feature of the case. Every clue generated multiple interpretations. Every interpretation raised new questions. As investigative techniques improved through the 1960s and 1970s, police reopened the case several times. Fresh detectives approached the evidence without the assumptions of earlier investigators. Old witness statements were reviewed line by line. Telephone tips that had once seemed insignificant were reconsidered. Anonymous letters stored for years inside evidence boxes were read again with renewed attention. Most still led nowhere. Some witnesses had died. Others no longer remembered details clearly. Addresses had changed. Businesses had closed. Potential evidence that might once have existed had disappeared with time. Even so, investigators refused to abandon the search. The unidentified boy had become more than a homicide victim. He represented every child whose voice had been permanently silenced. Public interest remained remarkably strong. Newspapers periodically revisited the story, especially on anniversaries of the discovery. Journalists interviewed retired detectives who described the emotional burden of working a case without resolution. Television programs introduced the mystery to new audiences who had never heard of the boy in the box. Each broadcast generated another wave of tips. Each wave revived hope. Each hope faded. Some callers claimed the child resembled cousins who had vanished decades earlier. Others pointed investigators toward distant relatives whose family histories contained unexplained disappearances. DNA technology did not yet exist as an investigative tool, leaving detectives dependent on traditional methods of verification. Birth records, death certificates, school enrollment, hospital files, family interviews. Most claims collapsed quickly under scrutiny. One recurring challenge involved memory itself. Human recollection changes over time. Events merge. Faces blur. Stories become influenced by newspaper articles, conversations, and repeated retellings. Detectives had to separate genuine recollection from sincere but inaccurate belief. It was painstaking work. Occasionally, a lead appeared unusually promising. Investigators would spend weeks examining it. Boxes of documents accumulated. Witnesses traveled for interviews. Photographs were compared. Only at the end would the evidence reveal that the child being investigated could not possibly be the victim. Every disappointment carried emotional weight. The investigators were not simply eliminating suspects. They were watching another possible identity disappear. As forensic science evolved, specialists revisited physical evidence preserved from the original investigation. Hair samples, photographs, fingerprints, dental records, and preserved documentation were carefully maintained because authorities recognized that future technology might unlock information impossible to obtain in 1957. That foresight proved invaluable. Although investigators could not yet anticipate modern DNA analysis, preserving the evidence ensured that later generations would inherit more than faded reports. They inherited possibility. During these years, another important realization emerged. The absence of missing person reports matching the victim strongly suggested that whoever had cared for him before his death either deliberately avoided authorities or was incapable of reporting him missing. That distinction mattered. If loving parents had searched desperately for their son, investigators believed some official record would almost certainly exist. The silence pointed elsewhere. Perhaps toward abuse. Perhaps toward concealment. Perhaps toward circumstances investigators had not yet imagined. Still, those remained theories rather than conclusions. Law enforcement carefully avoided declaring explanations unsupported by evidence. The mystery's extraordinary nature also attracted amateur investigators. Citizens spent years researching public records, comparing childhood photographs, writing letters, and developing independent theories. Some contributed useful observations. Others unintentionally complicated the investigation by generating unsupported speculation that spread far beyond the available evidence. Police welcomed credible information but remained cautious. Facts mattered. Rumors did not. Among the most persistent questions involved the child's life before death. Where had he slept? Who had fed him? Did he have siblings? Did he know kindness? Had anyone ever celebrated his birthday? Those questions could not be answered through forensic science alone. They required a name. Without identification, nearly every aspect of the victim's life remained hidden. The case acquired national significance not only because of its mystery, but because it exposed limitations within mid-20th century investigative systems. There were no national computerized missing person databases. Communication between jurisdictions depended on mailed reports, telephone calls, and personal contacts. Records remained scattered among countless agencies. A missing child reported in one state might not easily be compared against unidentified remains discovered elsewhere. Investigators worked tirelessly within those limitations, but the system itself presented enormous obstacles. Decades later, many detectives would reflect that the boy in the box investigation helped demonstrate why centralized information sharing would become essential for future homicide investigations. The child had unknowingly influenced policing far beyond his own case. Yet none of those improvements solved the mystery. The little boy remained unidentified. His grave became a place of quiet remembrance. Visitors occasionally left flowers or small toys. People who had never known him mourned him anyway. Some came because they had children of similar age. Others simply could not accept that a child had entered history without a name. The emotional connection endured across generations. Detectives often remarked that homicide investigations usually lose public attention after enough time passes. This case never truly did. Perhaps because the victim was so young. Perhaps because there appeared to be no family demanding justice. Or perhaps because every parent could imagine the unimaginable. The investigation continued to evolve alongside advances in science. Forensic artists produced increasingly refined facial reconstructions. Improved photography, enhanced archival images. Evidence preservation techniques ensured that fragile materials remained available for future examination. Every advancement inspired renewed optimism. Maybe this would be the breakthrough. Maybe this would finally reveal who he was. But optimism repeatedly encountered the same obstacle. There was nothing reliable to compare against. No confirmed relatives. No known medical history. No documented childhood. The investigation remained suspended between evidence and absence. Then, during one of the many comprehensive reviews, detectives reconsidered a question that had been asked countless times before. What if investigators had been looking in the wrong direction? For years, much attention had focused on identifying the child through public records and missing person reports. But what if the people responsible for him had intentionally ensured that no such records existed? The possibility was not new, but growing awareness of severe child abuse cases across America gave it renewed relevance. Investigators recognized that some abused children lived almost completely isolated from society. Some rarely attended school. Some never received regular medical care. Some were deliberately hidden from neighbors. The boy in the box might have belonged to that tragic category. If true, conventional identification methods were unlikely to succeed. The realization was sobering. It suggested that the very circumstances surrounding the child's life may have prevented investigators from finding him after his death. The mystery deepened not because detectives failed to search. It deepened because the victim himself may have been hidden long before the murder ever occurred. That possibility transformed the investigation from a search for one night's events into a search for an entire missing childhood. A childhood that, somewhere behind closed doors, had unfolded without witnesses willing or able to speak. And if someone had succeeded in concealing a little boy throughout his life, investigators feared they had also become skilled at concealing the truth after his death. The unanswered questions were accumulating faster than the confirmed facts. Yet one certainty remained. Somewhere, beyond the paperwork, beyond the forensic reports, beyond the headlines that had echoed across America for years, there existed a complete story. A story that began long before a cardboard box was left beside a quiet road. A story that someone, somewhere, had spent extraordinary effort trying to keep buried. By the early 1960s, the investigation had entered unfamiliar territory. Most homicide cases either advanced toward prosecution or slowly exhausted every practical lead. This one seemed to do neither. It simply endured. The file remained open, the evidence remained preserved, and every so often a new piece of information surfaced, just convincing enough to pull detectives back into the maze. The boy in the box was no longer just a Philadelphia case. It had become a national mystery. Police academies discussed it as an example of the extraordinary challenges surrounding unidentified victims. Investigators from other states requested copies of reports, hoping that a fresh perspective might reveal what years of familiarity had concealed. Crime magazines feature the child's photograph beside bold headlines asking the same question that had haunted authorities since 1957. Who was he? Despite thousands of investigative hours, the answer remained painfully out of reach. One reason the case continued attracting attention was its unusual combination of certainty and uncertainty. Detectives knew a great deal about the victim's final condition. They knew approximately how old he was. They knew the likely cause of death. They knew where his body had been discovered. They knew he had experienced physical abuse before his death. Yet they knew almost nothing about his life. That imbalance made every new lead seem significant. Among the many people unwilling to let the case fade was a medical examiner with a long-standing interest in unidentified victims. Years after the original investigation, he revisited the preserved records, photographs, and autopsy findings, convinced that careful observation might still uncover overlooked details. His review did not overturn the original conclusions, but it reinforced something investigators had believed from the beginning. The child had almost certainly spent time in an environment where repeated abuse went unnoticed or unreported. The challenge was determining where that environment had been. Attention returned once again to the location where the body had been found. The wooded area near Susquehanna Road had always appeared deliberate. It was secluded enough to delay discovery, but not so remote that it required specialized knowledge to reach. Detectives reconsidered whether the killer had selected the site because of familiarity, convenience, or simple opportunity. Traffic studies were reviewed. Old maps were examined. Historical aerial photographs were compared. Investigators attempted to reconstruct what the area had looked like on the night the body was abandoned. Several possibilities emerged. The offender may have lived nearby. The offender may have worked nearby. Or the location may have been chosen because it lay along a familiar travel route. Each explanation was plausible. None could be proven. As the investigation continued, another important aspect of the evidence received renewed attention: the cardboard bassinet box. It had originally been manufactured for an infant's bed. That detail raised uncomfortable questions. Had the box remained inside the child's home for years after infancy? Was it simply being reused for storage? Or had it been obtained shortly before the crime for an entirely different purpose? Detectives traced the product's distribution as far as surviving records allowed. They learned where similar bassinets had been shipped and sold, but retail documentation from that era remained too incomplete to identify a purchaser with confidence. The box continued to symbolize both promise and frustration. It appeared important. It refused to reveal why. Investigators also re-examined witness statements collected during the original search. Human memory can change dramatically over time, but occasionally forgotten details return unexpectedly. Detectives contacted individuals who had lived near the scene in 1957, asking them to revisit memories from decades earlier. Some remembered seeing unfamiliar vehicles. Others recalled unusual activity in the woods. A few believed they had heard news of the discovery almost immediately. But memory alone could not establish facts. Without independent evidence, investigators treated such recollections carefully. One recurring observation involved the timing of the body's discovery. Because the first witness delayed reporting what he had seen, valuable time had passed before police secured the scene. That delay almost certainly affected the investigation. Weather conditions changed. Potential trace evidence deteriorated. Tire impressions faded. Wildlife disturbed the area. No one blamed the witness for what happened afterward. But detectives recognized that those lost days could never be recovered. By now, forensic pathology had advanced considerably compared with the techniques available in 1957. Specialists revisited preserved documentation, searching for subtle findings that earlier investigators may have been unable to interpret. Some conclusions became more refined. Others remained unchanged. The child had likely been deceased for only a relatively short period before being discovered. His injuries remained consistent with blunt force trauma. His body had been cleaned before being abandoned. Those core findings continued to withstand scientific review. Investigators increasingly appreciated the importance of preserving every original photograph and report. Details that seemed insignificant decades earlier could become meaningful as technology improved. Even the smallest observation, a measurement, a notation, a preserved hair sample, might someday answer questions that had resisted generations of detectives. That belief kept the evidence intact. Outside official circles, public fascination only intensified. The mystery inspired newspaper retrospectives, radio discussions, and eventually television documentaries. Each retelling introduced the case to a new generation, many of whom found it difficult to believe that an unidentified child could remain nameless for so long. Letters continued arriving at police departments. Some contained thoughtful theories. Others repeated rumors that investigators had already examined years earlier. Every credible submission was documented. Most added little that could be verified. Still, authorities understood that unsolved cases often turn on a single overlooked fact. No lead was dismissed without review. Then came one of the most widely discussed developments in the history of the investigation. A woman, later publicly identified only by the pseudonym M, contacted investigators with a deeply disturbing account. She claimed that, as a child, she had lived with her abusive mother, who had allegedly obtained a young boy under circumstances she did not fully understand. According to her statement, the child was subjected to severe mistreatment inside the home. She described him as withdrawn, frightened, and frequently abused. Her account included details that appeared, at least initially, to align with aspects of the investigation. She said the boy often ate baked beans. The autopsy had noted partially digested food consistent with a recent meal, though it did not identify baked beans specifically as a confirmed last meal. She described the child being bathed. Investigators already knew the victim's body had been washed. She suggested that, after a violent incident, the child's body had been transported and abandoned. The similarities immediately drew attention. Detectives conducted extensive interviews. They examined the locations she described. They attempted to verify the timeline through independent records. The claim generated considerable interest because it appeared to offer something the investigation had lacked for years, a narrative explaining both the abuse and the absence of missing person reports. Yet investigators also encountered serious difficulties. Many elements of the account could not be independently corroborated. Some details conflicted with available evidence. Others relied entirely upon memories from many years earlier. No physical evidence conclusively connected the woman, her family, or the alleged residents to the victim. Authorities considered her information important enough to investigate thoroughly. They did. But ultimately, they could not establish that her account accurately explained the crime. The theory remained exactly that, a theory. It neither solved nor closed the case. Its public visibility, however, had lasting consequences. Many people came to believe the mystery had effectively been solved. Law enforcement never reached that conclusion. Detectives continued pursuing other possibilities, emphasizing that speculation could not replace evidence. The case demanded proof. Proof remained elusive. Years continued passing. Retirements reshaped investigative teams once again. Boxes of evidence changed hands. Fresh detectives inherited decades of reports, witness interviews, photographs, laboratory findings, and unanswered questions. The responsibility was immense. Every generation hoped to become the one that finally restored the child's identity. By the late 20th century, another revolution was quietly transforming criminal investigations across America. DNA. The emergence of forensic DNA analysis changed homicide investigations in ways earlier detectives could scarcely have imagined. Cases once considered impossible suddenly became solvable. Biological evidence preserved for years acquired entirely new significance. The boy-in-the-box investigation was among those poised to benefit. Authorities carefully evaluated the preserved evidence to determine what biological material might still exist. Unlike fingerprints or eyewitness testimony, DNA had the potential to identify victims through family relationships rather than direct recognition. For the first time, investigators began to imagine a future in which the child might be identified even if every person who had known him remained silent. It was an extraordinary possibility. But technology alone would not solve the mystery overnight. DNA databases were still developing. Family reference comparisons required appropriate samples. Forensic genealogy, the technique that would later transform cold cases, had not yet emerged as an investigative tool. The science offered hope, not certainty. The little boy remained unidentified. His grave continued receiving visitors. Fresh flowers appeared beside the headstone. Small toys were sometimes left in quiet remembrance. Many visitors had no personal connection to the case. They simply believed that no child deserved to be forgotten. That simple act of remembrance became one of the investigation's most enduring legacies. Long after witnesses faded and detectives retired, strangers continued speaking for a child who had never been able to speak for himself. Yet somewhere beyond the flowers, beyond the headlines, beyond the decades of speculation, the truth still existed. It waited inside forgotten memories, hidden documents, lost family histories, or perhaps within biological evidence preserved since 1957, evidence that had survived long enough to meet a generation of science capable of asking entirely new questions. For the first time in decades, investigators began to believe that the impossible might no longer be impossible. Not because the mystery had grown smaller, but because forensic science was finally beginning to catch up with it. The arrival of DNA technology did not transform the investigation overnight. There was no dramatic announcement, no immediate match, no detective rushing into a room with the missing answer. Instead, progress came quietly, almost invisibly, through years of scientific advancement that slowly changed what investigators believed was possible. For decades, the boy in the box had remained trapped inside the limitations of the era in which he died. Detectives in 1957 relied on eyewitnesses, fingerprints, paper records, and public recognition. By the late 20th century, forensic science had introduced an entirely different approach. A victim no longer needed to be recognized by someone who had seen his face. Biology itself could become a witness. The challenge was preservation. DNA testing depends on biological material that survives the passage of time. Fortunately, investigators who handled the original case had preserved evidence with exceptional care. Hair samples, photographs, fingerprints, dental records, and other forensic documentation remained available. Most importantly, biological evidence associated with the victim had not been discarded during the many decades that followed. That decision would eventually prove invaluable. As laboratories improved their techniques, authorities periodically revisited the case to determine whether newer methods could recover additional information. Early DNA technology had limitations. Samples that were degraded or extremely small often produced incomplete results. Scientists therefore approached the evidence cautiously, understanding that future methods might succeed where current ones could not. Patience became part of the investigation. Meanwhile, the broader world of criminal justice was changing rapidly. Across the United States, cold cases that had remained unsolved for decades suddenly began yielding answers through DNA. Murderers, once believed beyond identification, were linked to crimes through biological evidence. Victims buried without names were finally identified through comparisons with relatives. Every successful case strengthened hope in Philadelphia. If other mysteries could be solved after 30 or 40 years, perhaps this one could too. Investigators carefully monitored developments in forensic science, particularly those involving unidentified human remains. New national databases improved communication between agencies. Dental records could be compared more efficiently. Fingerprint systems became computerized. Missing person investigations gradually evolved into coordinated national efforts rather than isolated local searches. Even with these improvements, the boy in the box remained an extraordinary challenge. There was still no confirmed family reference, no verified missing person report, no known identity against which the evidence could be compared. The investigation required more than technology. It required a starting point. As years passed, specialists revisited the victim's physical characteristics with increasing precision. Facial reconstructions were updated using improved forensic techniques. Artists worked alongside scientists to produce images intended to represent the child as naturally as possible. The goal remained unchanged from 1957. Someone, somewhere, might recognize his face. The reconstructions circulated widely. Police departments displayed them. Media organizations revisited the mystery. Internet discussion forums eventually introduced the case to audiences far beyond Philadelphia. Thousands encountered the child's story for the first time. Many believed they could help. Authorities received new emails, letters, and telephone calls. Some tips originated from retired nurses. Others came from former social workers, teachers, neighbors, or distant relatives who believed family stories might connect to the unidentified child. Every credible lead was documented. Most failed under verification. Still, investigators understood that cold cases often depend on persistence rather than probability. Then another revolution quietly emerged. Forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA comparison, which depends on known reference samples, forensic genealogy examines shared genetic markers among distant relatives who voluntarily submit DNA to genealogical databases. By identifying individuals who share portions of inherited DNA, genealogists can gradually reconstruct family trees extending across multiple generations. The technique had already demonstrated remarkable success in other long unsolved investigations. It offered something unprecedented, a path toward identifying victims whose immediate relatives were unknown. Authorities recognized its potential, but applying the method required careful legal, scientific, and ethical consideration. Laboratories needed usable DNA profiles. Genealogical experts needed sufficient genetic information to build family relationships. Every step required precision because a single incorrect assumption could redirect years of investigation. The boy in the box case appeared ideally suited for this emerging science. If biological material remained adequate, perhaps investigators no longer needed someone to recognize the child. Perhaps they only needed distant relatives who unknowingly shared portions of his DNA. The possibility fundamentally changed the investigation. For the first time in generations, detectives possessed a realistic strategy for identifying the victim, even if every witness had disappeared. Evidence was submitted for increasingly sophisticated analysis. Scientists worked carefully. Cold case detectives coordinated with forensic specialists. Genealogists prepared for what could become one of the most significant unidentified child investigations in American history. Progress remained slow. Unlike television dramas, real forensic genealogy unfolds over months and often years. Family trees branch outward through marriages, births, deaths, migrations, and name changes. Historical records must be verified independently. Census documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, cemetery records, newspaper archives, and other sources gradually combine into a coherent picture. Every relationship requires confirmation. Every conclusion must withstand scrutiny. Detectives resisted public speculation. The investigation remained active. No announcements were made until evidence justified them. Throughout this period, the boy in the box continued to occupy a unique place within American criminal history. Universities discussed the investigation in forensic science courses. Law enforcement conferences referenced it during presentations on unidentified victims. Journalists periodically revisited the mystery, emphasizing not only the brutality of the crime but also the extraordinary dedication of generations of investigators. The case had become a symbol, not simply of failure, but of perseverance. Each generation refused to abandon the child inherited from the previous one. His grave remained a destination for visitors. Flowers appeared season after season. Children sometimes left small stuffed animals. Adults who had followed the story since childhood returned decades later, still hoping to witness the day when the little boy would finally receive his name. Many detectives admitted privately that identification had become as important as prosecution. The killer might already be deceased. Witnesses might no longer be alive. Evidence concerning the homicide itself might have deteriorated beyond recovery. Yet restoring the victim's identity remained possible. That alone would represent justice of a different kind. As genealogical research progressed, investigators began identifying extended biological connections. Rather than immediately revealing the child's parents, the analysis gradually pointed toward broader family networks, distant cousins, shared ancestors, historical family lines. Each discovery narrowed the possibilities. Investigators traced descendants, compared records, eliminated branches that could not fit the available evidence. The work demanded extraordinary patience. Names repeated across generations. Families relocated between states. Children were born under changing circumstances. Some historical documents contained errors. Others had been lost entirely. Professional genealogists reconstructed relationships piece by piece, sometimes advancing only a single generation after weeks of research. Still, the family tree slowly grew. The investigation, once defined by absence, now accumulated connections. Not certainty. Connections. Each one brought detectives closer to understanding where the child had come from. At the same time, authorities remained careful not to overstay progress. Genetic relationships alone could not explain how the child died. They could identify biological relatives, but identification and homicide investigation are separate challenges. Finding the family would answer one question. It would inevitably create many more. Who had been responsible for raising him? Who last saw him alive? Why had no missing person report ever been filed? Could surviving relatives explain the circumstances? Or had the truth disappeared with those directly involved? Investigators prepared themselves for difficult conversations. If living relatives were identified, many might know nothing about the child's existence. Others might possess fragments of family history without understanding their significance. Some could have spent entire lives believing different versions of events. The investigation therefore proceeded with exceptional sensitivity. Facts would come before assumptions, evidence before conclusions. As scientific work continued behind the scenes, public attention occasionally surged whenever new forensic breakthroughs occurred elsewhere. Every major cold case success prompted renewed questions from journalists. What about the boy in the box? Has there been progress? Authorities consistently replied that the investigation remained active. They declined to discuss details that could compromise the inquiry. Behind those carefully worded statements, years of scientific work continued. Laboratory analysis, genealogical reconstruction, historical research, cross-referenced family records. None of it produced dramatic headlines. All of it moved the investigation forward. By now, more than half a century had passed since a cardboard box had been abandoned beside a quiet road in Philadelphia. Entire generations had lived and died. Technologies, once considered science fiction, had become standard investigative tools. The city itself had transformed beyond recognition. Yet the little boy remained at the center of one of America's oldest unsolved child homicide investigations. He had never grown older. His photograph remained forever frozen at 4 or 5 years of age. The mystery surrounding his identity had become larger than any individual detective. It belonged to history. And history, at last, was beginning to answer. Not through luck. Not through a forgotten witness suddenly coming forward. But through science patiently connecting strands of DNA across decades of family history, proving that even time could not erase every trace of a child's existence. The investigation was approaching a moment that detectives from 1957 could scarcely have imagined. After more than 60 years, the first true glimpse into the little boy's origins was finally beginning to emerge. It would not immediately explain his death. It would not identify his killer. But it would accomplish something that had once seemed impossible. The child known only as the boy in the box was no longer entirely alone in the historical record. Somewhere, hidden within the branches of an expanding family tree, his name was waiting to be found. For more than 6 decades, the boy in the box had existed in 2 separate worlds. In one world, he was a homicide victim whose case had haunted detectives, forensic experts, and the public since the winter of 1957. His photograph had appeared in newspapers, documentaries, police bulletins, and forensic textbooks. Millions had seen his face. In the other world, hidden somewhere within countless birth certificates, census records, marriage licenses, cemetery registers, and forgotten family histories, there existed a name. The investigation had spent years trying to connect those 2 worlds. Now, for the first time, science offered a realistic bridge. The process was painstaking. Forensic genealogists did not begin with a family waiting to be contacted. They began with fragments of shared DNA. Those fragments pointed toward distant biological relatives, people who had never heard of the boy in the box and, in many cases, had no idea they were contributing to one of America's oldest cold cases. Investigators reconstructed family trees generation by generation. Great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, children, grandchildren. Branches divided, expanded, and stretched across multiple states. Some family lines ended. Others multiplied into hundreds of descendants. Each branch required verification through historical records. No assumptions were permitted. Every relationship had to be documented independently. Birth certificates confirmed parentage. Marriage records established family connections. Death certificates explained disappearances. Census reports revealed where families had lived at specific moments in history. Newspaper archives filled in missing details. The investigation increasingly resembled historical research as much as criminal investigation. As genealogists narrowed the possibilities, detectives quietly began locating living relatives whose DNA might help confirm the developing picture. These conversations required extraordinary sensitivity. Many relatives had absolutely no knowledge of the investigation. Others had only vague stories passed down through generations. Few imagined that an unidentified child from 1957 could somehow be connected to their own family history. Authorities explained the purpose carefully. Participation remained voluntary. Each comparison brought investigators closer to certainty. Bit by bit, uncertainty gave way to evidence. One family branch could be excluded. Another remained possible. Additional testing followed. The family tree narrowed further. Meanwhile, detectives revisited decades of investigative files through an entirely new lens. Every interview, every anonymous tip, every witness statement, every theory. They asked a simple question. If this emerging family connection proved accurate, did anything from the historical investigation suddenly make more sense? Some earlier assumptions remained unsupported. Others gained renewed significance. Still, investigators remained disciplined. Identification would require proof, nothing less. As months passed, confidence grew. The genetic evidence aligned consistently with historical documentation. Independent records supported the genealogical reconstruction. Separate investigative paths increasingly pointed toward the same conclusion. The unidentified child was no longer entirely anonymous. Investigators now believed they knew who he had been. Before making any public announcement, authorities subjected the evidence to repeated review. Cold case investigations of this magnitude leave little room for error. Every laboratory finding underwent verification. Every genealogical conclusion received independent examination. Officials understood the consequences of a mistaken identification. The child had waited more than 60 years. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Finally, in late 2022, after decades of unanswered questions, Philadelphia authorities stood before cameras to announce a historic development. The boy in the box had been identified. His name was Joseph Augustus Sorelli. The announcement marked one of the most significant breakthroughs in the history of unidentified homicide victims in the United States. For 65 years, America had known him only through a heartbreaking nickname. Now he was once again a person, a child with a name, a child who had belonged to a family, a child whose existence could no longer be erased. The revelation stunned the public. 4 generations, countless theories had attempted to explain the mystery. Many assumed the child's identity had been lost forever. Instead, modern forensic genealogy had accomplished what thousands of interviews, nationwide publicity campaigns, and decades of traditional investigation could not. It restored his identity. Yet the announcement also reflected remarkable restraint. Authorities intentionally revealed only limited information regarding Joseph's biological family. Investigators emphasized that identifying the child did not automatically identify those responsible for his death. Living relatives deserve privacy unless evidence established criminal involvement. Law enforcement therefore released Joseph's name while withholding certain family details that remained relevant to the ongoing investigation. The homicide case itself remained open. That distinction was crucial. The mystery had changed. It had not disappeared. Reporters immediately began asking the questions everyone had anticipated. Who were his parents? Where had he lived? Who raised him? Why had no one reported him missing? Who killed him? Investigators answered carefully. Some questions could now be addressed. Others could not. Authorities confirmed that Joseph had been born in January 1953, making him nearly 4 years old at the time of his death in February 1957. That information refined earlier estimates made by medical examiners. They also confirmed that genealogical research had successfully identified both sides of his biological family. Beyond those facts, investigators declined to discuss many details, explaining that the homicide investigation remained active. The restraint disappointed some observers. Others understood immediately. Public curiosity could not outweigh investigative integrity. Detectives continued pursuing answers. The identification transformed the case in profound ways. For decades, investigators had searched for a nameless child. Now they could examine an actual family history. Historical records became more meaningful. Timelines could be reconstructed with greater accuracy. Potential witnesses previously unknown to investigators could finally be located. Questions once impossible to ask suddenly became practical. Where had Joseph spent his early years? Who had legal responsibility for him? Who interacted with him during the final months of his life? Identification opened investigative doors that had remained locked since 1957. It did not guarantee what investigators would find behind them. The public reaction was deeply emotional. Many people who had followed the case for decades described feeling unexpected relief. The murder remained unsolved. Justice remained incomplete. Yet something fundamental had changed. The child buried for generations as America's unknown child now rested beneath his own name. Visitors returned to the cemetery with flowers. Some quietly spoke his name aloud. Joseph. No longer simply the boy in the box. For retired detectives who had spent portions of their careers on the investigation, the announcement carried special meaning. Some had long believed they would never see the child identified. Others had preserved evidence specifically because they hoped future technology would succeed where contemporary science had failed. Their patience had been justified. The careful preservation of evidence across decades had made the breakthrough possible. Without that foresight, forensic genealogy could never have been applied. The investigation also highlighted the extraordinary collaboration required to solve modern cold cases. Traditional detectives, forensic scientists, DNA specialists, professional genealogists, archivists, medical examiners. Each discipline contributed pieces of the puzzle. No single breakthrough solved the mystery alone. The identification resulted from years of coordinated effort. Yet even amid celebration, investigators returned repeatedly to the central reality. Joseph Augustus Zarelli had been identified. His killer had not. The questions that haunted Philadelphia in 1957 remained haunting today. Who inflicted the fatal injuries? Why was the child abused? Who transported his body to the roadside? Why was no missing person report ever filed? Did others know what had happened? Or had the truth disappeared with individuals who were no longer alive? Those questions became even more urgent after identification. Because anonymity could no longer explain the silence. Joseph had belonged to a real family. A documented family. Somewhere within that history lay the circumstances that had led to his death. Investigators believed identifying the victim represented the beginning of a new investigative chapter rather than the conclusion of the old one. The case had not ended. It had evolved. Instead of searching blindly through millions of unknown possibilities, detectives could now focus upon a specific family network, documented timelines, and historical relationships. That focus dramatically improved investigative direction. Whether it would ultimately produce a prosecutable suspect remained uncertain. Many individuals directly connected to Joseph's childhood were likely deceased. Memories had faded. Records had disappeared. Time remained the investigation's greatest adversary. Still, the impossible had already happened once. A nameless little boy had regained his identity after more than 6 decades. Detectives understood better than anyone that impossible cases sometimes yield extraordinary answers. And somewhere beyond the breakthrough that restored Joseph Augustus Sorelli's name, another answer still waited. The answer that had haunted America from the very beginning. Not who he was, but who had stolen the chance for him to grow up. The announcement that the boy in the box had finally been identified changed the emotional landscape of the case forever. For 65 years, investigators had searched for a missing child without knowing his name. They had chased fragments of information, followed thousands of false leads, and carried a photograph of a little boy whose entire identity had been reduced to the place where his body was found. A cardboard box. A patch of woods. A cold February morning. Now, for the first time, the child had a name. Joseph Augustus Sorelli. But with that name came a new and even more painful reality. Identification had solved only half of the mystery. The child had been found. The victim had been recognized. But the person responsible for his death remained hidden. The investigation had entered a new chapter, not a conclusion, but a transformation. For decades, detectives had been asking one question above all others. Who was this child? Now they could finally ask the question that had waited in the shadows since 1957. What happened to Joseph Augustus Sorelli? And who was responsible? The breakthrough created opportunities that investigators never had before. A name opened doors. A family history created a timeline. Biological connections provided a foundation that traditional detective work had lacked for generations. But the passage of time had taken its toll. Many people connected to Joseph's early life were no longer alive. Potential witnesses had passed away. Memories had disappeared. Documents had been lost. The investigation now faced a different enemy. Not uncertainty. Time. The circumstances surrounding Joseph's childhood became the central focus of renewed investigative efforts. Detectives began examining family relationships, historical records, and the environment in which the child had lived before his death. The goal was not simply to find a suspect. It was to reconstruct a life that had remained almost completely hidden for decades. Who cared for Joseph? Where did he live? Who had access to him? Who saw him during the months before February 1957? Those questions became the foundation of the modern investigation. The identification revealed that Joseph was not a child who appeared from nowhere. He had been born. He had a family. He had a history. Somewhere, there had been moments before the tragedy. Moments that investigators needed to understand. The public response following the identification was overwhelming. For many people who had followed the case since childhood, the announcement felt like a long-delayed promise finally being kept. The little boy, whose face had appeared in newspapers for decades, was no longer an unknown victim. He was Joseph. The name mattered. Names connect people to the world. Names create records. Names allow history to remember. For years, his grave had carried the words, America's unknown child. Now those words represented a chapter that had finally closed. But the murder investigation remained open. Philadelphia authorities made clear that identifying Joseph did not mean the search for justice was complete. The case was still an active homicide investigation, and detectives continued examining evidence that had survived more than 6 decades. The question of responsibility became more complicated than ever. In many cold cases, identifying a victim leads quickly to identifying a suspect. A family member recognizes a name. A witness remembers an event. A hidden relationship becomes obvious. The boy in the box case was different. The identification provided answers about Joseph. It did not immediately provide answers about the person who harmed him. Investigators had to separate fact from assumption. They could not simply accuse individuals based on family connections or public speculation. A homicide investigation requires evidence, physical evidence, reliable testimony, a documented connection between a person and the crime. Without that, even the strongest theories remain only theories. This caution was especially important because of the age of the case. In 1957, forensic tools were limited. Crime scene processing was far different from modern standards. The investigation began before DNA profiling existed, before computerized databases, before digital surveillance, before modern approaches to analyzing cold cases. Evidence that might have immediately identified an offender today either did not exist or could not be recovered. Still, investigators believe the original case file contained valuable information. Every photograph, every interview, every laboratory report, every handwritten note, decades of investigative history represented a record of what had already been tried and what remained possible. The modern review also benefited from a broader understanding of child abuse investigations. In 1957, society had a different awareness of domestic violence and child neglect. Many warning signs that would receive immediate attention today were often overlooked or misunderstood. Children living in abusive environments could remain invisible. Neighbors might hesitate to interfere. Teachers might not recognize patterns. Medical reporting systems were less developed. Investigators examining Joseph's case decades later understood that his disappearance from public records might not have been accidental. Some children are hidden because people around them fail to notice. Others are hidden because someone actively works to keep them unseen. Determining which situation applied to Joseph remained one of the most important unanswered questions. The identification also renewed interest in the timeline of his final days. Medical evidence had long suggested that Joseph suffered severe abuse before his death. The challenge was determining where and when those injuries occurred. Did the abuse happen inside a family home? Did multiple people know about it? Was someone responsible for his care while another person caused harm? Or was one individual responsible for both his suffering and his death? Each possibility carried different investigative implications. Detectives continued reviewing available information while avoiding public conclusions. The case demanded patience. The public, however, wanted answers. After decades of waiting, many people hoped identification would immediately reveal the entire truth. But cold case investigations rarely unfold that quickly. A name is a beginning, not an ending. The story of Joseph Augustus Zarelli demonstrated one of the most difficult realities of criminal investigations. Solving one mystery can reveal an even deeper one. For 65 years, America wondered who the child was. Now America knew. But the question remained of how a 4-year-old boy could die and remain unclaimed for so long. That question carried a painful implication. Someone should have known Joseph. Someone should have noticed his absence. Someone should have reported him missing. Yet when police discovered his body in 1957, nobody came forward. No desperate parents arrived. No relative demanded answers. No family member publicly searched for him. The silence surrounding Joseph's death became one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Even after identification, that silence remained difficult to explain. Investigators continued searching for people who might have information about Joseph's life. They appealed to the public once again, not for a name this time, but for memories. Someone who lived near him. Someone who attended school with him. Someone who saw him before his death. Someone who knew a family secret that had remained hidden for decades. The appeal was different from the campaigns of the past. The child no longer needed recognition. He needed witnesses. The investigation had moved from identification to accountability. And in cold cases, witnesses often emerge in unexpected ways. A forgotten photograph. A family story repeated for generations. A document stored in an attic. A confession carried silently for decades. Investigators knew that time could destroy evidence. But time could also change people. Someone who remained silent in 1957 might speak in 2023. Someone who feared consequences decades earlier might finally decide that the truth mattered more than the past. That possibility kept detectives searching. The case had already proven that decades were not an absolute barrier. For 65 years, Joseph's identity had seemed impossible to recover. Then science, persistence, and cooperation succeeded. The same determination now turned toward finding justice. The world had finally learned the name of the little boy in the box. But his story was still incomplete. A child's life had been reduced to a few tragic moments. Investigators wanted to restore more than his identity. They wanted to restore the truth. Because Joseph Augustus Zarelli was not created by the crime that ended his life. He was a child who existed before that moment. A child who had a beginning. A child who had a family. A child whose future was stolen. And somewhere within the unanswered questions surrounding his final days remained the truth about what happened in Philadelphia during the winter of 1957. The box had revealed a victim. DNA had revealed a name. But only evidence could reveal the person responsible. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli marked one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of American cold cases. But for investigators, the celebration was brief. Because behind the historic announcement was a reality that could not be ignored. A 4-year-old boy had been murdered. And after more than 6 decades, the person responsible had still not been held accountable. The case had transformed from a mystery of identity into a search for truth. For years, the question had been simple but impossible. Who was the boy in the box? Now the question had become far more complicated. Who had Joseph trusted? Who had failed him? Who knew what happened during the final days of his life? And why did nobody come forward? The investigation entered a new era where detectives no longer searched through an ocean of unknown possibilities. They now had a confirmed identity, a biological history, and a clearer understanding of a child's background. But the passage of time remained the greatest obstacle. More than 60 years had passed since Joseph was found. People who may have held answers were elderly or deceased. Homes had changed owners. Neighborhoods had transformed. Family memories had faded into incomplete stories passed from one generation to another. Cold cases are often described as puzzles. But this case was different. It was a puzzle where many of the original pieces had already disappeared. Still, investigators continued. They returned to the evidence with new questions. The original investigation had focused heavily on identifying the child because, without a name, every possible path was blocked. Now every path could be examined again. The child's family connections provided investigators with a historical map. They could analyze relationships. They could examine locations. They could reconstruct movements. They could search for explanations that had been impossible to explore in 1957. The goal was not to rewrite history. It was to understand it. One of the most troubling aspects remained the complete absence of a missing child report. In modern investigations, the disappearance of a 4-year-old would immediately trigger a massive response. Police would search neighborhoods. Media outlets would broadcast alerts. Families would organize searches. But in Joseph's case, none of that happened. His absence apparently went unnoticed by authorities. That fact continued to haunt investigators. How could a child disappear without a public alarm? How could a family continue living while a child was missing? The answer likely depended on circumstances surrounding Joseph's life before his death. Investigators examined whether he had been living in a stable household, whether he had been hidden from society, and whether those responsible for him had deliberately avoided institutions that might have created records. The possibility of isolation became central. A child who rarely interacted with outsiders will be far harder to identify. A child without school records, medical visits, or community connections could disappear almost completely. The original investigation had already suspected something similar. The modern investigation now had the opportunity to examine that possibility with a confirmed identity. At the same time, authorities remained careful about separating Joseph's biological family from responsibility for his death. A family connection does not automatically indicate involvement in a crime. Investigators understood that identifying relatives was only one step. Evidence would determine what role, if any, individuals played. This distinction became especially important because public attention surrounding the case was enormous. Millions had followed the story. Many people wanted immediate answers. But law enforcement could not replace evidence with speculation. The truth had taken 65 years to uncover. The final answers would require the same patience. As detectives reviewed historical records, they encountered the challenges common to old investigations. Documents were incomplete. Some records had been destroyed over time. Some witnesses could no longer provide statements. Names changed. Families moved. Connections that once seemed obvious became difficult to establish. Yet modern investigators had advantages that their predecessors could never have imagined. Digital archives allowed faster searches through historical documents. Online databases connected records from different locations. DNA technology provided biological confirmation. The tools had changed. The mission had not. Find the truth. Give the victim justice. One of the most emotional consequences of Joseph's identification was the change in how the public remembered him. For decades, people referred to him by the circumstances of his death. The boy in the box. The unknown child. Those names describe tragedy. They did not describe a person. The announcement changed that forever. Joseph Augustus Sorelli was no longer only a symbol of an unsolved crime. He was a human being. A child who had lived for nearly 4 years before the world learned about him. The importance of that distinction was not lost on investigators. In homicide cases, victims are often remembered through the worst moment of their lives. But every victim had a life before the crime. Joseph had a childhood. He had a voice. He had expressions, habits, fears, and moments that existed beyond the final photograph. Identification restored a piece of that humanity. Yet the circumstances of his death remain deeply disturbing. The evidence collected in 1957 continued to suggest that Joseph had suffered significant trauma before his death. Investigators believe the violence against him was not a single isolated event. The injuries indicated a longer period of suffering. That raised difficult questions about who had access to him and who might have witnessed signs of abuse. In many child abuse cases, the most important witnesses are not strangers. They are people nearby. Neighbors. Family friends. Relatives. Teachers. Doctors. People who notice something unusual but fail to report it. Whether that happened in Joseph's case remained unknown. But investigators understood that someone may have information that could still matter. The renewed investigation therefore focused not only on finding a suspect, but also on finding knowledge. Who remembers Joseph? Who remembers seeing him? Who remembers a child who suddenly disappeared? Who remembers a family situation that seemed unusual? After decades of silence, even a small memory could become important. A photograph. A conversation. A forgotten family document. A childhood recollection. Cold cases often survive through fragments. A single detail can connect decades of uncertainty. The boy in the box investigation had already demonstrated that principle. For 65 years, the answer to Joseph's identity existed somewhere in scattered genetic information. No single clue solved the mystery. Thousands of tiny connections eventually revealed the truth. Investigators hoped the same could happen with a homicide. One piece of evidence. One witness. One forgotten fact. Any of them could change everything. The public continued to follow the case closely. Documentaries revisited the story. News organizations examined the breakthrough. People who had grown up hearing about the unidentified child now learned his real name. A mystery that had belonged to one generation had become part of American history. But the final chapter remained unwritten. The identification was a victory, yet justice required more. The detectives who continued working the case carried a responsibility inherited from those who came before them. The original investigators in 1957 had looked at the same photograph and asked the same questions. Who was this child? What happened to him? Who abandoned him? More than 60 years later, some of those questions had finally been answered. Others remained untouched. The difference was that investigators now had something they had never possessed before. A starting point, a name, a family history, a connection to the past. The darkness surrounding Joseph's final days had not disappeared, but the child himself was no longer hidden. The cardboard box that once represented anonymity had become the beginning of a story about perseverance, science, and the refusal to forget. America had finally learned who he was. Now investigators faced the final challenge: finding the person who made sure he was never able to tell his own story. The name Joseph Augustus Zarelli changed everything. For decades, investigators had been searching through darkness, trying to identify a child who existed only through photographs, forensic measurements, and the heartbreaking circumstances of his death. Now there was a name, a birth record, a family history, a beginning. But the investigation still faced the same painful reality that had existed since 1957. The person responsible for his death remained unknown. The discovery that finally revealed Joseph's identity did not close the case. Instead, it opened a new and more focused investigation. Detectives no longer had to ask where the child came from. They could now examine the world that existed around him before he was found inside a cardboard box in Philadelphia. The search moved from identification to accountability. For law enforcement, this was a crucial distinction. A victim can be identified without a crime being solved. A name can be recovered without justice being achieved. And in Joseph's case, investigators knew that the most important questions were still unanswered. What happened during the final days of his life? Who was with him? Who saw him last? Who knew the truth? The original crime scene remained frozen in history. A wooded area near Susquehanna Road. A discarded bassinet box. A little boy wrapped in a blanket. But more than 6 decades later, investigators had to examine that scene differently. The question was no longer only how someone abandoned a body. It was how someone could allow a child to disappear before death without creating a public search. The absence of a missing person report remained one of the most disturbing elements of the case. In ordinary circumstances, the disappearance of a 4-year-old child would have created immediate attention. Someone would have called police. Someone would have searched. Someone would have demanded answers. But Joseph vanished silently. That silence suggested that the circumstances of his life were far from ordinary. Investigators examined the possibility that Joseph had lived in isolation. A child hidden from schools, doctors, neighbors, or social institutions would leave behind fewer records, fewer witnesses, fewer opportunities for intervention. The tragedy may not have begun when his body was discovered. It may have begun much earlier, during the years when he was still alive. Understanding that possibility became one of the central challenges of the renewed investigation. Detectives began looking backward through time. They studied family histories. They examined old records. They searched for relationships, locations, and events that could explain how Joseph's life unfolded. Every document became a potential clue. Every date became significant. A birth certificate, a residential address, a family connection, a newspaper article, a photograph. Information that had once seemed unrelated now had the potential to reveal a hidden timeline. The investigation required patience. Historical records rarely provide complete stories. They provide fragments. A family may appear in one census and disappear in another. A person may change addresses repeatedly. A name may appear differently across documents. A marriage record may reveal a relationship that had never been considered. A death certificate may explain why a witness could no longer be interviewed. Detectives and researchers worked through these fragments carefully, trying to rebuild the years before Joseph's death. The goal was not only to understand where he came from. It was to understand the environment surrounding him. The identification also changed the emotional meaning of the case. For generations, people had looked at the child's photograph and wondered who he was. Now they could say his name. That simple act transformed public memory. The phrase "boy in the box" had described a mystery. Joseph Augustus Zarelli described a person. A child who had once been unknown to the world was now remembered as someone who had existed before tragedy. This mattered deeply to investigators and advocates who work with unidentified victims. A name is more than information. It is recognition. It restores dignity. But recognition also brought painful questions. If Joseph had a name, why had no one reported him missing? If he had relatives, why had no one come forward? If people knew him, why had he remained unidentified for so long? Those questions became more difficult with every passing year. The investigation had to consider a harsh reality. Many of the people who could have provided direct answers were likely gone. The passage of time had removed potential witnesses and possible suspects alike. The investigators of 2022 and beyond were searching through history. They were looking for voices from a past that had become increasingly quiet. Still, cold cases have a unique characteristic. Time can destroy evidence, but time can also weaken fear. A person who remained silent decades earlier may eventually decide to speak. A family's secret protected for generations may eventually surface. A document hidden away may finally be discovered. Investigators understood that truth sometimes emerges slowly. The same persistence that identified Joseph could potentially reveal what happened to him. The forensic genealogy breakthrough also demonstrated a larger lesson. The past is not always unreachable. A case once considered impossible had moved forward because science found a way to connect present-day people with events from the distant past. The same principle now applied to the homicide investigation. Somewhere, there might still be someone connected to Joseph's final days. Someone who remembered. Someone who knew. Someone who carried information without realizing its importance. The challenge was finding that person. Public interest remained intense. The story of Joseph Augustus Zarelli had become one of the most recognizable cold cases in America. His identification was covered around the world, not only because of the mystery, but because it represented something universal. A child had been forgotten. Then he was remembered. A victim without a name had regained his identity. But the final question remained unanswered. Who was responsible for taking his life? The renewed attention also brought renewed speculation. Some members of the public developed theories based on historical information. Some connected unrelated events. Others suggested explanations without evidence. Investigators repeatedly emphasized the same principle that had guided the case from the beginning. Evidence must lead. Not assumptions. Not rumors. Not public pressure. The truth required proof. This careful approach was especially important because Joseph's case involved real people and real families. The identification of a victim can bring closure, but it can also reopen painful histories. Investigators understood that every person connected to the case deserved fairness. The goal was justice, not accusation. As detectives continued reviewing the evidence, they returned again and again to the physical facts from 1957. The cardboard box. The blanket. The location. The injuries. The condition of the body. Each detail represented a moment in time that could never be changed. The evidence told investigators that Joseph had suffered. It told them that someone had tried to conceal what happened. It told them that the person responsible had made decisions after the crime. But evidence could not yet reveal the person's identity. That final barrier remained. For more than 60 years, the boy-in-the-box mystery had been defined by one impossible problem after another. First, the child had no identity. Then he had no known family. Then there was no clear path forward. Science solved the first mystery. History solved the second. Now investigators faced the final challenge: solving the murder itself. The case had reached a point that previous generations of detectives could only dream about. They were no longer searching for an unknown child. They were searching for justice for Joseph Augustus Zarelli. And somewhere in the remaining evidence, buried beneath decades of silence, investigators believe the answer still existed. Because crimes can remain hidden. Witnesses can disappear. Memories can fade. But the truth does not vanish completely. It waits. Sometimes for years. Sometimes for generations. And in Philadelphia, after more than 60 years of unanswered questions, the search continued for the final piece of a mystery that had begun with a cardboard box and a little boy whose name the world would never forget.